Everything was as usual. The classroom was noisy. Students were preparing for the lecture. Some were exchanging jokes. Others were handing in their latest assignments. The door suddenly opened and a figure appeared in the classroom, which everyone instantly recognized: Keanu Reeves. But no one could believe their eyes. Keanu had come to a math lecture as an ordinary student, without security, without noise or fuss. He walked to the very back row, sat quietly, and did not draw attention to himself. He wasn't concerned with the looks. He didn't care that some students were watching him curiously. Keanu was here to learn. He wasn't an actor, he was just a student. But Professor Grayson, an authority in the mathematical world, only smirked. "Student number 52, said the professor, casting a glance at Keanu. "Well, maybe this isn't something you'll be able to handle today." Everyone turned to look at Keanu. Professor Grayson was known for his strict attitude towards students, and his words were never simple. This was a real challenge. The lecture began as usual. The students, whom Grayson had been teaching for several years, behaved as expected. Some were taking notes, others were on their phones, and some were even busy with their own things, sitting in the hope that the professor wouldn't notice their relaxed attitude. Grayson stood at the board and began to break down a complex mathematical theory for them, not noticing that his words didn't sound as clear as usual. He drew a long equation on the board, which was to become the basis of the entire lecture. All the students watched him with the same interest they had displayed throughout the semester, but among them was one person who clearly didn't fit the picture. Keanu Reeves sat in the back row, resting his arm on the desk, with an expression on his face that could hardly be called interested. His eyes didn't leave the board, but he wasn't taking notes, asking questions, or even attempting to engage with what was happening. Grayson noticed this, and something shifted inside him. Usually, students would write down everything he said, try to understand, attempt to get involved. But Keanu, his lack of reaction was surprising. The professor's gaze became more guarded. He continued talking about complex differential equations, but now his words began to sound more stubborn. "Dear students," he said with irony in his voice, "this is not an easy topic. These equations can confuse even the most experienced mathematicians, so be ready that you might not understand everything right away." Grayson quickly scanned the classroom and returned to Keanu, whose silence now seemed suspicious. "And you," he emphasized to Keanu, "will probably find it difficult to deal with these equations. We know that not everyone can quickly grasp these things, and for you it might be easier to take a role in some movie than to work through such calculations." These words came out with emphasis, and all the students felt the tense atmosphere. Some, sitting closer to Keanu, quickly turned their heads, waiting for his reaction. Keanu, however, didn't budge. He sat there, relaxed, not paying attention to the professor's jab. But Grayson, apparently, couldn't stop. His irritation grew. He continued to write on the board, now more energetically, with fierce confidence that perhaps this lecture would become his little test for the students. Differential equations are the foundation of many theories. They are essential for understanding the real world, the professor said, now not hiding his superiority. But such things are not for everyone. Some simply cannot grasp them. Let's see who among you can solve at least one of these problems. Keanu continued to sit, not breaking his calm observation. His eyes seemed to catch every symbol, every detail of the equations on the board, but he wasn't writing anything down. The students also remained silent, each absorbed in their own thoughts and tasks. But none could fail to notice how Grayson was insisting on his point, more and more emphasizing that the task was too difficult for most. Grayson, feeling his absolute control over the class, finally decided it was time to check who among the students could perceive the theory in practice. His lips twisted into a barely noticeable smile as he turned back to the board and wrote an even more complex equation. This was the equation that, as he knew, would be impossible for everyone. The topic of the equations was complex enough to guarantee failure for most students, and Grayson was confident that none of them would be able to give the correct answer. "Try to solve this," he said with emphasis, stepping back so everyone could see his confidence. "And you might want to return to simpler tasks, like acting in movies." The professor, evidently, was convinced that he would have the full right to mock Keanu if he failed to handle the task. His words, full of sarcasm, echoed through the classroom. When the professor returned to his desk, all eyes again turned to Keanu. The students were eagerly waiting to see what would happen next. The professor continued to amuse himself with thoughts of his victory, but the students couldn't understand how Keanu, the actor, would react to such provocations. Meanwhile, Keanu stood up. Everyone in the class felt as if everything around them was slowing down. It was like a scene from a movie. He walked calmly toward the board. Professor Grayson leaned forward, expecting to see yet another failure. Keanu calmly approached the board and took the chalk. He wasn't in a hurry. He wasn't nervous. He simply stood up and began to solve the problem as if it were just another task he dealt with every day. With smooth, confident movements, he began to write the solution. He wasn't writing like an ordinary student trying to find an answer. He wrote like a person who knew exactly what he was doing and was doing it with incredible ease. While the students watched him with bated breath, Grayson's confidence slowly began to slip away. When Keanu finished, he simply stepped aside and, without saying a word, turned to the professor. "Here's your answer. Please check it," he said calmly, as if he had just solved a simple equation. Professor Grayson didn't immediately approach the board. He stood still, as if in a daze, unable to believe what had just happened. His gaze remained fixed on the equation that Keanu had just solved. Thoughts swirled in the professor's mind, thoughts he couldn't immediately express. He didn't know what to do with this. He approached the board. His hands were trembling as he began checking each step of the solution. The more he checked, the more his face changed. He was starting to realize that he had no right to doubt the correctness of this answer. It was all right. It was perfect. This is impossible," he muttered, staring at the solution. His lips could barely form these words. There was a gleam in his eyes, something that didn't belong to a person who had just understood something unbelievable. The entire room was in shock. The students sat in silence, unable to believe their eyes. Could this really be true? Keanu Reeves was not just an actor. He was a mathematical genius, hidden behind the public persona of a celebrity. Professor Grayson became like stone. Everything happening around him couldn't possibly be part of his usual reality. He had studied mathematical theories for years and had always believed that he understood the limits of possibility. But now, his own beliefs were shaken. "How did you do this?" the professor finally asked, though he didn't know how to continue the conversation. He was so stunned that he couldn't answer the question himself. Keanu silently smiled and turned to him. "Sometimes you just have to not be proud to see the obvious," he said softly, "and learn to think differently. Mathematics has always been my passion." Everyone in the class, including the professor, froze in the realization that they were witnessing not just an amazing moment, but a true revelation. Keanu Reeves, the actor they were all used to seeing in a completely different context, turned out to be a real genius. Grayson was in shock. This was impossible. He had given his students the most complex mathematical problems many times, but for a solution to appear so easily and quickly, this simply defied all logic. His confidence, which had been with him all his life, began to crack. The person sitting in the last row, this actor who had spoken to him just a few minutes ago, was not just a student. He was a mathematical genius hidden beneath the mask of an ordinary person. The professor walked up to the board, his hands trembling slightly as he began checking the solution again. Keanu returned to his seat, sitting calmly, showing no sign of anxiety. With every new look at the solution, at the equation, at the steps Keanu had so confidently written down, Grayson felt his own authority crumbling. "It's impossible. Grayson whispered, as though hoping this was all just a joke, a mistake. But when he double-checked, his face turned pale, and his lips could barely pronounce, This is correct." The professor froze, his eyes widened, and he looked at Keanu as if expecting some hint of a joke, some sign that this wasn't true. But Keanu only smiled softly and turned back to the board, showing no pleasure in his victory. Grayson felt his mind hit a dead end. This didn't fit with his understanding. He was a mathematical genius. He knew what differential equations were, how to solve them, and how these problems formed the basis of many scientific theories. But now he found himself on the other side of the barricades, having to admit that his knowledge wasn't enough to understand what had just happened. The students, sitting in silence, couldn't help but notice how much the professor's face had changed. He still couldn't believe it. Doubts and questions swirled in the professor's mind, questions he couldn't ask out loud. How did Keanu solve this equation so quickly? How could his knowledge of mathematics be so deep? After all, Keanu didn't look like someone who could be doing mathematics at such a high level. He was an actor, a star, not a scientist. But how? The professor quietly asked, approaching the board again and feeling the chalk in his hand. He couldn't take his eyes off what had been written. How is this possible? Keanu, still calmly sitting in his seat, simply shrugged as if this was the easiest thing in the world for him. And although his words were simple, they seemed incredible in this context. "Sometimes you have to not be too proud to see the obvious," he said, smiling slightly. The professor fell silent. Everyone in the class felt that silence, that slow-motion reality. Keanu Reeves, the actor who seemed so far from academic life, turned out to be the one who could shatter all the familiar stereotypes, revealing a new perspective on someone who could truly hide genius abilities. The professor stood there, frozen in the realization of what had just happened. He was a person who was used to teaching others, who believed his knowledge and experience were unquestionable. He was an authority in his field, and even though students might sometimes doubt him, there was always someone who could confirm his competence. But now, in this classroom, in this room, in front of all his students, in front of Keanu, he felt weak and unable to explain what he had just seen. He was someone who knew what it meant to lose control, but he had never thought it would happen in such circumstances. He looked at the board again, at the solution, at the equation that was not difficult for one person but seemed impossible for others. Then he looked at Keanu, as if he expected him to give the answer to the question that had been troubling him the most. You really did this?" the professor finally said. Keanu calmly nodded, his gaze sincere and calm. "I just loved mathematics," he said, maintaining his composure. "Sometimes it's more important to be yourself than to try to be someone you're not." The whole class was in shock. The students began whispering, their voices filling the air, but they couldn't grasp what was happening. As soon as they began to understand that this ordinary student sitting among them had just done what seemed impossible for everyone else, they tried to process all the information that had just come to them. Keanu Reeves turned out to be the one who broke through all the boundaries of stereotypes, who removed the mask of the actor and became something much more. The students looked at him with respect, admiration, and amazement. They were stunned by how this man had so calmly, so confidently demonstrated his mathematical abilities. It was unfathomable, and yet the fact remained. Keanu Reeves was not just a movie star, he was a mathematical genius. Grayson was stunned. His inner pride, his ambitions collided with what he had just realized. Keanu was not someone who could be easily understood, someone who could be labeled and placed into expectations. He was great not because he aspired to be a star, but because he had managed to stay hidden and humble despite all his talents. I understand, the professor finally spoke, his voice calm but sincere. "I was wrong, and it seems my entire approach to teaching has been flawed. We so often judge people by their appearance or by how they behave in public. But you've shown me that there's so much more than we can even imagine." Keanu gave a slight nod, his face showing no pride, only calm determination. His words and actions made Grayson rethink everything he had taught his students. It was a lesson that deeply touched his heart. Everyone in the classroom began to realize that this moment was far more significant than just solving a complex problem. Keanu had not only showcased his mathematical abilities, but also demonstrated the importance of respecting everyone, regardless of their appearance, popularity, or role in society. Professor Grayson felt that his life as a teacher had changed. Keanu had become an example of how important it is not to judge by first impressions, how important it is to allow people to reveal their talents on their own terms. It was this transformation, this inner revelation, that was the true result of the lecture. Later, after the lecture, a real storm of rumors swept through the university corridors. The students discussing what had happened could not calm down. How had Keanu Reeves, an actor, managed to solve a mathematical problem that even the best students couldn't handle? Everyone knew Keanu was a screen star, but they hadn't expected him to hide such a talent. Every word spoken in the classroom quickly spread through the university walls. Some students whispered to each other, others ran from one classroom to another, and soon the building was in full uproar. In the library, at the department, and even in the cafeteria, the incredible discovery was being discussed. Keanu Reeves was not just someone who acted on screen, he was so much more. He was someone who had hidden his abilities, choosing the path of a simple student to simply learn and enjoy the process. Students admired his humility and the way he approached solving problems, and they could not help but feel that this person was something more than just a famous name. Meanwhile, Professor Grayson could not shake the thought of what had happened in the lecture. After the class, he visited his empty classroom several times and stared at the very problem Keanu had solved so easily. He couldn't understand why his own pride had been shaken so deeply, but the more he thought about it, the clearer it became that Keanu had shown him the most important lesson he had missed all these years. Grayson sat in his office, looking through old notes, lectures, and theories he had taught over the years. He felt that he had encountered something that questioned all his beliefs. He was a highly regarded professor, leading important scientific projects, and all his colleagues considered him an authority in mathematics. But here was Keanu Reeves, an actor with no connection to this field, who had shattered all his notions of who and what could be a genius. It was painful. The professor, who was used to his knowledge always being accepted as truth, suddenly realized that his approach to teaching had been wrong. He had grown accustomed to judging students for their failures, devaluing their attempts, thinking that only those who demonstrated high results could be successful. But here before him was someone who didn't need this recognition, who didn't seek attention, but was still living proof that knowledge and skill could be hidden behind any mask. "How could I have missed this?" he whispered to himself. "How could I have been so blind?" Grayson realized that Keanu was the one who had given him the true lesson. He understood that his upbringing, his harsh teaching methods, were not enough to truly understand how students could unlock their talents. His inner voice told him that he needed to change his approach, to not just teach, but also guide students to be themselves, to not be afraid to reveal their true abilities. Meanwhile, Keanu continued attending classes, but now in a different light. He had become an example for many students. In his eyes, there was no pride or vanity. His motivation was something deep, elusive. He didn't strive for fame. He didn't want to be the center of attention. But his calmness, his confidence, inspired other students. They began to understand that talent could be hidden, but it would come out at the most necessary moment. Keanu was the kind of person who preferred to be a teacher to himself, not to others. Students started to understand that being a genius didn't always mean announcing it loudly. Being a genius was much more than just knowing more than others. It was the ability to use one's knowledge and talents in ways that benefited everyone around them. Professor Grayson began to notice how the students had changed. They no longer chased after grades. They began to understand that the true value of knowledge wasn't just theory, but the ability to apply that knowledge with sincerity and respect for others. Keanu, by his example, made each of them reflect on what they were truly seeking in their education and what they could offer the world. Despite the fact that Keanu remained the same student who preferred to stay in the shadows, his influence was undeniable. His presence in lectures began to have an effect on everyone. Students stopped viewing their education as a race for marks. They began to value the learning process more, to delve deeper into things that once seemed difficult and uninteresting. Professor Grayson noticed this change, and it made him reflect on his own teaching approach. He realized that he had too often used his knowledge as a weapon to demonstrate his superiority, forgetting how important it was to create an atmosphere where students felt equal, where they could freely express their ideas and interests. Keanu was an example of how important it was not to hide one's talents, but also not to use them to manipulate others. Grayson began to introduce new teaching methods. He started asking more open-ended questions, giving students the opportunity for independent reflection. He began to respect their opinions more, listening to their many voices, which before had seemed less important to him. It was a revelation for the professor. One day, several weeks after that significant day, Professor Grayson approached Keanu in the corridor. His face was filled with seriousness and respect. "Keanu, I want to offer you something," said Grayson, looking at the student who showed no sign of excitement. "It seems to me that you not only have the ability to continue learning, but you could also help all of us change our approach to teaching at this university." Keanu, unsurprised by the offer, simply nodded. "I'm not looking for fame, Professor," he replied. "I just want to teach. I want to help those who are ready to learn and support those who aren't afraid to show their weaknesses." Professor Grayson smiled, feeling his respect for Keanu grow even more. "Maybe you should think about teaching a course," he suggested, "but only if you're willing to work with us, with future generations, to help them become not just students, but people who can use their knowledge for the benefit of society." Keanu thought for a moment. He wasn't sure he wanted to become a teacher, but the professor's suggestion made him think. Maybe now, when everything had changed, he could pass on his knowledge and experience to those who, like him, were searching for their way in life. Every day, Keanu continued to amaze his classmates. He was not just an ordinary student sitting in class. He was someone who lived among them, yet was something else entirely. Every action he took, every word he spoke, every decision he made inspired those around him. He was not someone who sought recognition or wanted to be noticed. But that was exactly where his true talent lay, in his sincerity, humility, and dedication to the cause. When Keanu solved a problem on the board, it didn't look like just another task he was solving to complete his homework. It was like real art. He approached problems with incredible depth, taking his time, not trying to stand out. He did it because it mattered to him. He did it with respect for knowledge and for those around him. And that was how it inspired others. When he solved problems, students who had previously doubted themselves began to realize that anything was possible. They saw how Keanu, with incredible ease and tranquility, unveiled the mysteries of complex mathematical theories, and that filled them with confidence. They understood that genius wasn't about boasting about achievements, but about sharing knowledge, passing it on to others, and doing so without any pretense. But Keanu didn't limit himself to just passively attending lectures. He started helping his classmates solve problems. He became perhaps the most active student, but not in the way others were. He didn't raise his hand every time he wanted to say something, didn't try to stand out. No, he did everything quietly, calmly, unobtrusively, but with such depth that it could not go unnoticed. When his classmates encountered a difficult problem, they could simply approach him and get Not just an answer, but a whole explanation that opened up a new understanding. Keanu didn't rush, didn't try to show how smart he was. He explained with patience, as if every question mattered to him, as if there were no stupid questions. He taught not just how to solve problems, but how to think. Professor Grayson, observing all this, began to notice that the lectures had become more lively, more interactive. Inspired by Keanu's example, students started actively discussing the materials among themselves, helping each other, no longer afraid to make mistakes. They stopped fearing vulnerability and began to see errors as part of the learning process. And this was the result of the atmosphere Keanu had created. The professor, who had once been so strict and demanding, now saw that the true power of teaching wasn't about demonstrating superiority, but about inspiring and supporting others. It was a revelation for him. All his lectures, all his teaching methods now seemed empty in comparison to what he saw in Keanu. He realized that what truly mattered was not only imparting knowledge to students, but teaching them to love the learning process. Every day, Keanu became an increasingly important figure for the students. He wasn't the one standing on a pedestal, but he was the one standing beside them. Keanu showed that true strength wasn't about being the best, but about being honest and open. He was the one who helped others overcome their own fears and doubts. One day, when a group of students couldn't solve a difficult problem, Keanu approached them and offered to help. But his help wasn't simply about solving the problem. He didn't give them the solution. He helped them see the problem from a different perspective, making them think about how they could approach the solution from various angles. In mathematics, it's not just about solving problems, he said. It's about understanding how each one is connected to real life, how it can be used to solve real-world problems. If you learn to think as if the problem isn't just a set of numbers, you'll realize that you can find a solution where you thought there was none. It was a revelation. Students who had previously been unable to look beyond formulas and numbers began to understand that the true meaning of mathematics wasn't only in calculations, but in learning to think, analyze, and apply knowledge. Keanu taught them to approach learning from a different angle, to be curious, and not to be afraid to ask questions. One day, Professor Grayson approached Keanu with an unexpected proposal. "Keanu, have you ever thought about teaching? I think you could be an excellent teacher. Your approach to teaching, your ability to see potential in every student, it's something unique." Keanu was a little surprised, but his face remained calm. "I'm not sure I need to become a teacher," he replied. "I just want to continue learning, growing, and sharing what I know with others." Professor Grayson nodded, understanding that Keanu wasn't seeking attention, but he still saw in him a true teacher, someone who could inspire hundreds, if not thousands, of students to gain a deeper understanding of the world around them. Keanu was someone who could change the world of education. Inspired by Keanu's example, students began to change their attitude toward learning. They started to appreciate every moment they spent studying. For them, each lesson became important, each new material, a chance for self-expression and growth. Keanu showed them that mistakes were not the end, but the beginning of a new stage. What mattered wasn't being the best, but growing, learning, and sharing your experience with others. Students no longer saw education as a burdensome obligation, but as an opportunity to find themselves, to discover their true talents. They became not just students, but teachers to each other. Student life was filled with new meaning, and this was thanks to Keanu, who showed them the importance of support and openness. It wasn't just the students who began to change. Professor Grayson, along with other teachers, started rethinking their methods. They realized that the most important part of teaching wasn't only about transferring knowledge, but about inspiring students on their own journey. Through his example, Keanu showed how important patience, attention, and the ability to not only teach, but also to listen, really were. Teachers began to change their approach. They started showing more interest in what was important to their students, paying more attention to their needs and aspirations. A sense of equality, respect, and engagement filled the classroom. Students began to feel that their opinions mattered, and this allowed them to develop more freely. Everyone who was around Keanu understood that his influence on the university was invaluable. Keanu, remaining hidden and humble, had become a symbol of a new era in education. An era where the most important thing wasn't the stars, the grades, but the genuine desire for knowledge and mutual help. And although Keanu didn't seek fame, his example became the spark that ignited a fire. He showed everyone that being a genius didn't mean being proud and isolated from the world. Being a genius meant loving what you do and helping others learn to love it too.